Hello everyone, my name is Luna and today I am going to do a presentation on the theme of human rights with the following key question: why can human rights be violated by the state? So I will follow this plan. I will firstly define human rights, then I will try to answer to the question, why are human rights violated by the state? I will give two types of answer to this question. The first one being to avoid the protests and political opposition, and the second will be the protection of the country and the counterterrorism. And then I will ask some discussion questions. When we talk about human rights, many different things may come to our mind, but we all have that idea that these are your rights and obligations as a human being. Indeed, the different definitions that we can find say approximately the same thing. For the United Nations, human rights are rights inherent to all humans being, regardless of race, sex, nationality, ethnicity, language, religion, or any other status. Human rights include the right to life and liberty, freedom from slavery and torture, freedom of opinion and expression, the right to work and education, and many more. Everyone is entitled to these rights without discrimination. The first document to gather all these rights into an official list was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations in 1948 in response to the atrocities of World War II. It provided a list of 30 rights under the form of articles. We can also notice that some countries have their own document, like the British Human Rights Act of 1998. In the respect of these rights, we can quickly understand that the state is concerned. Firstly, it is directly mentioned in the 13th article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It is said that nothing in this declaration may be interpreted as implying for any state, group, or person any right to engage in any activity or to perform any act aimed at the destruction of any of the rights and freedoms set forth herein. End of the quote. So the citizens are supposed to respect these rights and obligations, but a system of justice is necessary to make sure that nobody tries to violate them. Moreover, the state itself should not try to jeopardize them and has to be the guarantor of the respect of human rights. So when are human rights violated by the state? Well, we can talk about two types of violations, one direct and one indirect. In the first case, the state can fail to uphold the human rights, and in the second, it can violate them consciously. We are going to focus on the latter case today. Indeed, a 2009 report of Amnesty International indicates that citizens are still tortured and abused in more than 81 countries, and that the freedom of speech is still restrained in more than 77 countries. So why can human rights be violated? The first response that I could give to this question would be to avoid the protests and the political opposition. Mainly in authoritarian countries where the regime is dominant, the idea is to keep the citizens under control. This way, nobody can initiate a revolution movement that could overthrow the government. In this logic, the government reduces the citizens' freedom to keep them disciplined. Saudi Arabia is a good example of this situation. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was one of the 8 countries to be opposed to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, when the text was adopted. The government in place is labeled as a unitary Islamic absolute monarchy, and it follows the strict rules of the Sharia, the Islamic law. Saudi Arabia is criticized a lot because of its violations of human rights. Indeed, it is known for being one of the countries that are still using judicial corporal punishment, like flogging or amputations in the case of a robbery, for example. We can notice in this case that the physical integrity of the citizens is affected, and that this goes against the basic human rights and freedoms that enable one to be free from torture, for example. This type of action aims to scare the citizens and deter them from revolting. The population knows that the regime is capable of hurting them, so they do not want to be considered as a criminal or an opponent. Moreover, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights mentions the right to participate in free elections or a freedom of assembly and association that are definitely shut down by the government. Indeed, within the Saudian state, no political parties is allowed and no national election is organized. The press is also tightly controlled and the government blocks a large part of the internet. After the Arab Spring of 2011, all public demonstrations were also forbidden. This is again a mean to control the population and avoid any type of political opposition. But even more than that, it prevents people from thinking that an opposition is possible because they don't have the right to gather to talk about it, and they are raised in the fear of the government as well as in the idea that this is the only regime possible. What we can see on the cartoon shown on my PowerPoint is a representative of Saudi Arabia as a chairman in the UN Human Rights Council. He has a sword that is stained with blood and he's asking if anybody has questions. This, to me, shows the very idea of politics through violence and the fear that it can inspire to the citizens that really do not want to be opposed and do not have the right to be opposed to the government. Another type of violation of human rights can be under the guise of the protection of the citizens themselves in the case of a counter-terrorist strategy, for example. In the United States, after the tragic incident of the 9/11, the government took several measures supposed to block any other terrorist action and adopted a law called the Patriot Act in October 2001, which allowed them to use the private information of the US citizens at any time without asking first and without warning the concerned citizens. This was supposed to prevent any terrorist action and protect the American citizens. However, media rapidly reported numbers of abuses due to the law. Firstly, this law breaks the right to a private life because anyone could be under surveillance without even knowing it, but it even went further. Indeed, some people suspected to be terrorists were detained without any trial and without concluding evidence of their link with terrorist groups. Again, the right to a fair trial is denied. The idea there is again to control the life of the American citizens with the cover of counterterrorism. I found this cartoon very interesting because it says that the Patriot Act is here to protect you from your freedoms. So this is very ironic, and it will lead me to my discussion questions. So in the two cases I just analyzed, we can see a violation of human rights, maybe one that is more disguised than the other, but both imply either a will to control the population or the idea that human rights and freedom are secondary. So this leads me to my discussion questions. I would like to ask you if in a time of COVID pandemic, you think that the measures adopted by some governments could reduce human rights and freedoms under the guise of health protection, just as the case that we just saw about reducing human rights under the guise of counterterrorism. So could we apply this to our current situation? Second, when should we start prioritizing the collective interest over individual freedoms? As we just saw with the case of the United States, should we protect the citizens from their own freedoms? And finally, what in this case distinguishes the countries that temporarily reduce individual rights and freedoms from authoritarian regimes, except these temporary aspects? Thank you all for listening.